Welcome to today's Ask the Rabbi session. There was originally a scheduled one which disappeared off of my schedule, and it does not appear that is now there. So I apologize for those who had gotten a previous alert for the live. It didn't show up on the scheduled afterwards. I don't know why. But we will begin asking the questions and going through them one at a time. Okay. So our last class was a few weeks ago, and in that class there is a question about flattery and relationships practices with those who have left or on their way to leaving Judaism, people who are engaged in some form of apostasy, unfortunately. So there are those who do that who aren't necessarily obligated in mourning practices. This is from the previous class. So the question here is, what extent is it just practically another faith or a statement saying they are not religious? I can't imagine that not practicing would be included in this. So I guess my short question is, what constitutes leaving Judaism? So there's what to say, there's a little bit to say on that. The issue is that the person who does not observe Torah and mitzvos often forgoes the rites of mourning. We don't tend to practice that way. Our practice is basically to, at the very least, if they practice some of it and did some things, but if people went and completely were apostates to another religion, converted to another religion, or they were actively looking to undermine Judaism somehow, and to be inimical to its practice, we would have a real issue with performing mourning rites for them. So that would be a real issue. So it's not necessarily that they just aren't religious, it's also that they are considered an apostate. So that is definitely the halakha. To what extent, we probably want to look at each case individually and just make an informed decision about it. So that's practically what I would recommend. It's not necessarily easy to say across the board. It's not always easy to define who has left the religion, but it's definitely worthwhile noting that some people do forego the honor and respect of mourning. So there is something there. By the way, I am currently not in the normal base medrash. I had to go get another office. The base medrash is currently occupied, so I apologize for the office scenery for today's class, but sometimes things have to be done. Okay. The next question is about a mouthwash, and the question is, you have to squeeze the mouthwash through a nozzle. This is Act brand mouthwash, and there's a nozzle on top of it, and you have to squeeze it through a measurement mark. So one could manually fail to create the precise amount, but to fail on purpose is still measuring. Can this vessel be used at all on Shabbat? So the question is a measuring question on Shabbat. So you're normally not allowed to measure things out or allot people a certain amount of things on Shabbos. It's a prohibition because you might come to write. So with mouthwash, you could just take this nozzle, flip it, and squeeze it into its receptacle without thinking about it. Hold it far enough where you're not actually reading it, and that would be acceptable. Okay. So most other questions now are going to be focusing on Pesach. So let's focus on Pesach here for a little bit. Okay, so question is, do we burn chametz? The first question is, do we burn the chametz on Friday? So this year, in 5785, Pesach's first day is on a Sunday. So that means that the holiday begins Saturday night. Generally speaking, Yud Daled Nisan, the day before, is when we do all of those fun things. Search for the chametz the night before, burn the chametz the next morning. Well, on a year like this, that's on Shabbos. We don't do searching, we don't do burning, we don't light candles, we don't do any of that. So the question is, so when do we do that? The answer is on Friday, which would be Yud Gimel Nisan. Interestingly enough, Yud Gimel Nisan is actually the day on which one could technically still do a kosher b'digas chametz, a kosher search for chametz, and fulfill their obligation enough where they would exempt themselves of having to do it that following night. And so therefore, on a night, on a year like this, that's what we would do, is we would do the b'digas chametz on Thursday evening, and then come Friday morning, you would go ahead and burn the chametz. And then you would do the actual bitul chametz on Shabbat itself. Okay, so that's how it breaks down. And generally speaking, people are providing some longer form information about how to do this properly. Meaning there's quite a bit going on. So there is the what to do with Pesach and Erev Shabbos, that is. So for example, for this year, so that's when Yom Tov is. So there's in a place like in Israel, okay. So you have a little bit less time to get this stuff done. So you need to get the chametz taken care of much earlier. Okay, so the sale of chametz needs to be done. The other things about that day are that the fast of the firstborn happens on Thursday. Okay, so you should try to attend the siyum on a day if you're firstborn. Okay, and the only other thing is that you need to finish koshering the kitchen on Friday. So other things you should do should be taken care of on a day. So for example, you can still make kitniyos for that Shabbos. You also are not allowed to eat regular matzah on that evening as well, because it's Erev Pesach. So what people sometimes do is they get prepared ahead of time as well. So you need to do the egg that day, the lamb shank that day, boil the hard eggs, and you also want to make you can wait for some of these things for after, but you want to make your salt water will all be done on that Friday. So I'm gonna send some things out into our group to help people prepare for that day, and we'll do some follow-up videos on it as well. Okay, that was the answer to that question. The next question is, why can't we do our own Pesach offering, and where's the ruling from that it can only be done at the temple? The answer to that question is, it's in the Rambam, Hilchos Beis HaBechira, right, the laws of the temple itself. It's in chapter 6, and it's at the end, in 16, and it comes from a Mishnah Eidios, basically saying that the holiness of the temple lasts forever. So that's where that kind of starts from. So what that halacha basically saying is that if you want to do a Korban Pesach, it has to be done at the Temple Mount. So there's a little bit of disagreement between Maimonides, the Rambam himself, and Rav Yosef Karo, and Rav Avram Davud. So Rav Avram Davud, the Ravid from Potier, who writes the Hasagos Ravid, who commonly had disagreements with Maimonides, he says that this is done. This can be done pretty much anywhere, not specifically just on the Temple Mount. And for example, after the temple was destroyed, a grandson, a great grandson of one of the Kohen Gadol, Chonio, went and built a sacrificial altar in Alexandria. So some people point to the fact that it wasn't necessarily clear what the halacha was afterwards. However, after some discussion, the rabbis, who the Sanhedrin were still around at the time, and they settled that the Har HaBayit should be the final place, according to Maimonides. Other people were like, no, that's not the final. That was not settled on by the Sanhedrin at all, and so it could still be brought. But it should. The thing is it sounds like you should bring it pretty much anywhere. But out of deference to the Rambam, it can only be brought on Har HaBayit. So we now have access to the Temple Mount itself. So it would appear that one should or could bring the Pesach sacrifice nowadays. Most people say, no, you can't, and you can't go up there. And we also, the problem is that we can't get properly purified because we don't have a way of purifying ourselves from the ritual impurity, from the tuma that we have in our lives regularly. But the Paschal sacrifice, the Korban Pesach, is not predicated on having everybody be ritually pure. It's brought anyway, even in ritual impurity. So it's what to say. So is it possible to bring nowadays? You make an argument for it. Will we bring it nowadays? No, we won't. Okay. Next question is, along with chametz, just for convenience, can past year dried esrogim be burned in the chametz burn barrel, as well as an old lulav, or is that a confusion of the mitzvah of that day? That question is very good. The correct answer is you should be burning them with it, especially the dried up hadassim, dried up lulav, anything that's left over. You can also burn the esrog in there too. The idea is that you should take the mitzvah of the lulav and use it for the mitzvah of biur chametz as well. So yes, the answer to that question is you should and you may take the mitzvah items from the lulav and esrog and use them to build a burning fire for the chametz. Again, which this year would be on Friday morning. Okay. Other Pesach questions that we have over here. I had a question about quinoa. Is quinoa kitnios? Is it not kitnios? Why or why not? Quinoa is super popular amongst Ashkenazim these days, and it became more and more of an interesting discussion for Pesach. Let's just explain kitnios, and then we'll talk about quinoa. So, kitnios is it started as an Ashkenazi custom, sometime in the late Middle Ages, probably about the 13th to 14th century, when they started getting deliveries of other types of small grains and noticed that there were wheat kernels being mixed in. Most of those small products, like beans and such, were cooked, and if you cook even one wheat kernel, you're going to make chametz, and now you're eating chametz with all of these other things, things that should be acceptable for Passover. And in fact, the Talmud itself talks about having puffed kernels and having puffed legumes and rice for Pesach. These things are all mentioned in there. So these things fell out of use because of the prevalence of mixing them with wheat products. So there was no real resolution other than to say they're not going to eat it. That's one thing. Then there is the second part of it, which developed a lot later, which is also related to this other custom known as gebrachts, v'nish gebrachts, okay, which is the idea of soaking matzah in liquids. So do anything with it besides baking it. That relationship was that people might make a mistake, and if they're allowed to use kitnios, they'll make bread out of it. They might accidentally use flour. That's literally the story. It was a case that happened. The rabbi's wife decided it would be a great idea to dip her fish in matzah meal and fry it, much like the way many people make schnitzel nowadays. And it turns out that people got confused and thought she was using flour instead of matzah meal, and they were making that for Pesach. So therefore, the rabbi made a big prohibition not to do that anymore. That's another stage of kitnios, is that people are gonna make it into bread. Therefore, they added on a bunch of new things. So in some places, they even prohibited. That's how they prohibited using things like corn, which was used to make it into bread. Also, because it sounds like other types of grains. The word corn itself also means it's a type of grain, and so therefore, to avoid the confusion, that became part of kitnios. And other things that were ground into flour, like flour from rice and flour from potatoes, were prohibited back in the day. Potatoes was one that wasn't really accepted through most of the Jewish world. It started in Eastern Europe, but when they were experiencing hard times finding food, that that one kind of fell off. You'll find it being mentioned, especially in 19th century literature, not to use potatoes because the flour was used to make bread products. Now it's one of the most popular things to make for people who cook breakfast, to make everything from potato flour. Does kitnios make sense? No, it absolutely does not. It's specifically a minhag that we keep, much like we keep certain other minhagim. Just because we kept it, we've retained the custom, even though the original reason seems to make no sense. So then the question was, well, if the original custom can't really be nailed down 100%. Oh, I forgot one thing before I go on to that. The last thing was to prohibit certain things because of their proximity in growing to wheat fields. So that's things like mustard seeds and coriander and cumin. Those things become prohibited because of their proximity. Now, some people have decided, well, it's okay to have coriander and it's okay to have cumin as long as they are grown in a chametz-free environment. Why not the mustard seeds? The Magen Avraham brings all these down in Tuf Nun Daled, and there seems to be these different reasons for it. In mustard, they were more strict about why can you get cumin but not mustard? Again, unclear, but such is the custom as it has developed. So let's talk about quinoa. So knowing that we know what we do know, that the custom isn't actually 100% clear, what do we say about quinoa? What is quinoa? Quinoa is a small seed that grows on a branch that comes specifically from South America. So a branch extrudes out, little tiny branches come from the same shoot, the main shoot of the branch, and grows into little tiny clusters of little tiny seeds. Anybody who has ever been to a bird food store or been to a pet store where they see bird food, there is something in there called millet. It grows exactly like millet. Millet, however, is quinoa, but quinoa is not. Why? They believe that there's enough of a difference that one can see a reason not to permit it. However, some of the same issues that appeared with quinoa appear with quinoa. It can be mixed with chametz. You have to make sure it's guaranteed it's chametz-free. You have to check it, even with a PESACH texture, so on and so forth. So quinoa, basically, why is it not quinoa? It's because everyone kind of agreed to just stop expending the quinoa prohibitions. When they included, for example, New World foods like corn and peanuts. Peanuts, for example, when I was a kid, peanuts weren't such a big deal. It just started to become a big deal. And I know many people, from 35 years ago, even 40 years ago, that assumed that you could use peanut oil, other type of things on Pesach, even have peanuts for Pesach. So it's entirely possible for you to have a custom where peanuts are permitted on Pesach, even for Ashkenazim. Not much different than having quinoa. So that's basically what it comes by. That's basically how it comes down, is that the quinoa is going to be fine to eat because basically there's not a strong custom to prohibit it. So that's what it comes down to, is just that. Now, even amongst the Sfaradim, some of them refrain from eating things like rice, some even like Moroccan Jews, for example, even though they are of Sephardi origin, they still don't eat that stuff. So find out what your community does and doesn't do. If you're not sure, I can look it up for you. Okay, we're not having a lot of live questions today. I have one more question here in the chat. So the last one is, when saying Shema with or for my daughter before bedtime, should I be saying Hashem instead of the name itself? No, when you're reciting in brachos, when you're reciting the Shema and you're reciting any prayer to teach your children, it is perfectly permissible to recite Hashem's name so that they recite it properly, and don't say Hashem. Don't hide the name in that case. You can teach it to them so that they learn to say it themselves. So there is no problem of hotza'at Shem levatala. You're not saying God's name wantonly. You're using it for the purpose of teaching children. That would be perfectly acceptable. So thank you for joining our first edition of Pesach editions for the Ask the Rabbi class. We will, number one, try to address the scheduling issues for next time. I do apologize. And we will also address more questions in the next edition. Also, to stay tuned to the channel. Make sure to subscribe so that we get updates for all the new Pesach information that will be coming out soon this week. Take care.